Okay, so I thought I would do a relatively short lecture on the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is, one of those canonical, theories that you cover in, macro, intermediate macro classes. The Phillips curve has certainly been one of the more important topics of conversation in macroeconomics since it's made its particular debut. And I would say that, amongst those ideas in macroeconomics that sort of sprung out of that kind of Keynesian neoclassical synthesis, the Phillips curve is probably one of the most hotly debated, hotly empirically tested. And so there's a really interesting, I think, story to be told. And then again, it's one of these things where over time we start to have a much more nuanced idea, and you'll see we sort of pull from kind of different quote unquote sides of the particular debate. Okay, so what is the Phillips curve? So the Phillips curve is really an empirical finding. Now there had been for a long time amongst some economists a belief potentially that unemployment and inflation, in particular wage inflation, seem to move in the opposite direction. So if you have unemployment, if unemployment goes up, you tend to have a reduction in wage inflation or maybe potentially wage deflation. And then if unemployment goes down, you tend to have wage inflation. And of course, the important part of this is that the most likely scenario is that wage inflation is going to translate into sort of general inflation. And so the Phillips curve was, sort of big idea is that, economic growth tends to have a trade-off with inflation, and the sort of avenue, the channel with which that trade-off occurs seems to be the labor market. And so you get economic growth in the labor market, and what tends to happen is that when you get growth in the labor market, wages start to go up because economic growth, tends to cause marginal product of labor to go up, so on and so forth. And so real wages rise because of economic growth. Well, real wages rising also means that there's going to be inflation because firms are now paying more for their employees. This is going to show up in prices. And so we know that there's a clear connection between wage inflation and general inflation. So therefore, if there is this connection between unemployment and wage inflation, that would also mean that there's a relationship most likely between unemployment and inflation. Now, this is on the surface, I think, just seems let me be like a straightforward point, and maybe backed up by some potentially questionable empirics, but it's actually a very, very important idea. And it goes back to the video that I just showed you, or the video that I just had talking about the different parts of the aggregate supply curve where we may be, and in a sense, where we want aggregate demand. The reason why this is an important concept is because what this sort of argues is that sort of once we get to a point of full employment, sort of the idea is going to be that it's going to start showing up on inflation. So that inflation, in a sense, far from being a negative economic sort of idea, ends up being a fairly positive one. And then ultimately, what sort of the Phillips curve argued was that because there was this inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment, then basically what central banks and Phillips ends up this mostly ends up kind of feeding into conversations about monetary policy. Phillips' argument is that the Phillips curve, which we're going to show in just a moment, offers policymakers a menu of monetary policy. Okay, so here's the idea, right? This is the Phillips curve. So you can see he's found a negative relationship between unemployment and wage inflation. This is, I believe, just UK data from 1861 to 1913. And so that's maybe potentially one weakness. It's a fairly small sample in that sense. There's no cross country variation for us to do anything with econometrically. And so yeah, we just have a very simple kind of time series relationship here. That's going to be one of the arguments people make ultimately about this very simple view of the Phillips curve. is that it gets some empirical things wrong, and so that in the future, when we know more about econometric, there's in a sense a correction to the Phillips curve. But there was also a theoretical pushback to the Phillips curve as well, and this coincides very much with next week's material on monetarism, and that's because after a lot of really nice success of the Phillips curve in the sort of early part of the 1960s, all the way through to kind of the last sort of 75%, if you will, the last 25% rather of the 1960s, so like 1967 on. I've mentioned that the U.S. experienced a considerable amount of inflation during this time period, and what also seemed to happen during this time period is that the economy sort of starts to slow down to the extent that you have policymakers are kind of doing everything they can to sort of continue buoying things, and so aggregate demand gets really pushed out in terms of fiscal policy. And then you don't really have monetary policy that's doing much to step in to sort of tame inflation. We get a lot of inflation, a lot of economic growth, and so that looks really good for the sort of Phillips curve. And so the 1960s is a time period where people feel pretty good about the Phillips curve of the 1960s. Now, the argument that comes after this and is that I skipped here. Excuse me. I apologize. So there's that slide's out of place. So but there's that theoretical sort of distinction starts to creep in, right? And so Milton Friedman and Phelps in the 60s argue that inflation expectations erode this trade-off, that essentially firms and consumers, if they expect inflation, they adjust their behavior to the extent that then in the future, the unemployment gap should not necessarily trigger any particular change in inflation. So that no longer was closing the unemployment gap, that would be reducing employment. No longer would that be seen as sort of necessary inflationary. At the same time, having the unemployment gap wouldn't also be seen as necessarily deflationary. So what Friedman and Phelps and then sort of really this gets crystallized in 1967 with the so-called Lucas critique that comes from Robert Lucas. So Robert Lucas basically argues that Friedman Phelps argument, that expectations argument is effectively true, and that when you sort of estimate the data with this particular idea in mind, you find a much weaker sort of relationship. Sorry, there's somebody outside my door. You find a much weaker relationship than sort of previously thought. So it really sort of called the question the Phillips curve. Part of this is also the experience of those supply side shocks in the 1970s. Again, people didn't necessarily perceive them as these sort of massive supply side shock, and that's where we think a lot of that early 1970s, mid 1970s inflation seems to come from. And so this is where you get a little bit of this tension. You have sort of in one corner kind of the Phillips curve argument that says, look, we can boost the economy and we get a little bit of inflation, but that's okay. But we're still boosting the economy. Then you have Friedman, Phelps, and ultimately Lucas, who argue that, well, no, because people alter their expectations to match alter their beliefs about inflation to match expectations. This then changes their current behavior, that you can't, in a sense, juice aggregate demand to boost output. That in a sense, because people perceive that boosting of aggregate demand is going to create inflation, people are going to start behaving today according to that expectation of inflation, which causes inflation today, which completely in their mind, the Lucas critique was essentially erodes your ability to actually juice aggregate demand and not simply cause inflation. So in a sense, what Friedman and then Lucas are arguing is a very classical neoclassical argument. If you boost aggregate demand is simply going to trigger inflation. This was, of course, against the sort of Keynesian idea that depending upon where you were in the aggregate supply curve, you could get aggregate demand to boost output, and you may not even get any inflation, or you might get a little bit of inflation, or maybe you get a lot of inflation. So this is where we come back to that Phillips curve argument that basically gave policymakers this menu of economic growth relative to inflation. Now, the truth is that when you look at the empirical sort of idea here, one thing about this is that the Lucas critique was very much sort of believed by a lot of economists. It continues to be a very profound idea today. But then, so Thomas Sargent publishes a book in, I believe it's 1986, in which he really takes a really hard look at this argument with respect to inflation and expectations and all this. And basically what sort of Sargent starts out as being very sort of pro-Lucas critique, but then by the time he publishes this book, what he sort of comes to believe is that the Lucas critique is fine. The empirical sort of finding that underlies the Lucas critique, that basically once you build expectations in the model, the Phillips curve completely flattens. I don't think he had a problem with that. I think his problem was that ultimately there was really no point to necessarily think about expectations in that sense, because that if you actually looked at way the sort of economy reacted, it did seem indeed to react to all of this, pro-cyclical. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat. That's the sign I'm talking too much. It was sort of a kind of restatement of the idea that indeed there does seem to be this particular trade-off. And what Sargent argued is that you get back to that point of there being the trade-off. In other words, the central bank can give themselves a Phillips curve, basically, to then have that menu of trade-off between output and inflation if they're time consistent. And the idea of time consistent means they basically tell you what they're going to do, and then they do it in the future. And over time, this builds trust. That's a huge part of modern monetary policy. As I've mentioned previously, the Fed stands up there. They tell you, hey, this is what we're going to do over the next several weeks. They then do, or I'm sorry, the next several months and over the next year. They then do it. That causes you to now have these expectations that you can trust the Fed. Ultimately, what the Fed is doing is they're trying to generate a Phillips curve for themselves. And by the way, you don't generate a Phillips curve for yourself simply so you can juice the economy when the economy is doing bad. You also create the Phillips curve for yourself so that you can tame the economy when it's starting to create a lot of inflation. So if we go back again, using the sort of post-COVID example, 2023, 2024, the Fed not only increases interest rates, or targets higher interest rates rather, but they signal that they are going to target higher interest rates for the foreseeable future. That essentially establishes in the sort of pro-Phillips curve people's minds a Phillips curve that then the Fed can increase interest rates as a means to slightly increase unemployment. Nobody wants to admit that, but that's what we're doing. And that's going to tamp down inflation. So if you go and you look at, for example, the unemployment rate, despite the fact that the economy is doing well, as I mentioned in the last video, it's slowing down towards the tail end of 2024. It's slowing down in part because of the contractionary monetary policy of the Fed trying to reduce, or successfully, I should say, reducing inflation. This is one of the reasons why I posted that article at the beginning of the term with Purdue's Bullard, the dean of the business school, who's a prominent monetary economist, arguing that we had achieved the so-called soft landing. Soft landing is you get inflation back down to where you want it, 2%, 2.5% target, and you don't have to put the economy into a recession to do that. We didn't have to put the economy into a recession, but we definitely had to weaken the economy a little bit. So when you look at 2024 into early 2025, you do see increases in the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate's like 3.5% in 2023. It now rises to above 4% in 2024. That's still what we would sort of consider in that range of full employment. So the economy is still considered fine, but you get upticks in unemployment, you get downtick in inflationary pressure. It certainly seems like the Phillips curve is still there, although I think the Friedman and Lucas sort of arguments that expectations matter, I think they're right. I think expectations do matter. I think that they don't necessarily matter as much as they think. And I think, like a lot of things in economics, they matter more sometimes than others. So the trick is sort of learning when is the Phillips curve kind of there and when is it not. And so a lot of the empirical sort of work on the Phillips curve has been estimating it. And one finding, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that the Phillips curve has been flattening. It's sort of continued to flatten over time. In particular, Ball and Mankiw and Blanchard show that there does seem to be this trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but it seems to be weaker now than it used to be. I think that's partly why you see there was a dramatic decrease in inflationary pressure in the U.S. economy. We went from almost 10% inflation down to now that inflationary target of 2.5%, 3% inflation, and we really did not cause that much of an increase in unemployment. And so, in a funny way, the argument is that not that the Phillips curve doesn't exist; it's just flatter now. And what's interesting about that is that from a policy perspective, this is good because what it means is that we might be able to tamp down inflation and we don't need to cause as much unemployment as we thought we needed to as before. That mainly maybe that inflation is, we're kind of coming back to this idea, I think, a little bit that inflation is this monetary phenomenon. Again, it's not that the monetarists had the entire view of the macroeconomy correct, but I think on some of this inflationary stuff, they were right to point out some of the flaws. It wasn't that the Keynesians got everything right about aggregate demand, but I think they were right to put out the flaws in the classical models. And so the Phillips curve is just, like I said, it's a canonical idea. It's something that everybody learns when they take intermediate macro, and it's you can sort of get a fairly biased interpretation of it depending upon if your professor is a sort of pro Phillips curve or kind of anti Phillips curve. I don't really have an opinion in that direction. I like the idea of the Phillips curve because it seems to be empirically true in many instances. But I also agree that, especially in a hyper expectations driven world, it makes sense to me. The math says that expectations are going to tend to cause that relationship to flatten. So that makes a lot of sense to me.